make sure we have plenty of time.
Can do. Hi, everybody. I'm in the back of the room and monitoring the Zoom session. My name's Sydney. I work here at the library. So Dr. Candy DeBerry is back for the third time since I've been working with adult programs to talk to us about gardening-esque type things. She was here in summer of 2022 talking about compost.
23.
23. Oh,
20, yeah, 23.
Yeah, and then fall in 23 about garlic, and now we're back for landscaping with native plants, which is something we've been talking back and forth about for a while. So very excited to have her here for this. As she mentioned a moment ago to the people in the room, there are some handouts in the front of the room. There's also the seed library. I brought down our seeds from upstairs, which is a free resource we have here at the library. Seeds that are repackaged into smaller quantities, so that way it helps reduce waste and gets more out into the community. So those are available at the front of the room. We have a binder that shows you what kind of seeds they are. And we also list them all online on our website through it's linked to a Google Sheet that also links to all the seller and plant provider information if we have it. So Dr. DeBerry is here tonight to talk to us about landscaping with native plants. If you are online, please enter any questions as they come up into the chat or hold them until she's done with her presentation, and I'll help facilitate the questions online as well as the people in the room. So
Peters Township Public Library has a plant swap coming up. That's the next garden related event, the end of April.
That's correct. Monday, April 29th, I think 6:30 again, or maybe 6 p.m. We'll have a plant swap. We welcome all kinds of plants as long as they are not invasive or harmful. You can have landscaping plants that you have dug up. They could be seedlings that you've started for your garden, or they could be house plants that you are ready to see move on to another home. So we'll have tables in here labeled by kind of plant, or like if they're outside, if they're for sunshade. So drop off some plants, take some plants. I found a lovely pothos last year here. It's very nice.
Great. Well, thank you, Sydney. Thanks everyone for coming in person, and all of you who are here virtually. And landscaping with native plants. So I've been thinking about native plants, focusing on native plants as ornamentals in my garden way back to 2007, actually, when I first started learning about the importance of native plants. And I want to share some of that information with you tonight. So we'll start with, we are supposed to start with, are you going to respond? No, I'll have to advance this.
It might be.
You know what? I think we are in.
It thinks you're on the Zoom still. And now if you try advancing it.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So we'll start with the question, what is a native plant? The old definition was that, and I'm looking at a native plant to Peters Township. So we're talking about this particular geographic location. So the old answer to be what would be a native plant for Peters Township, Pennsylvania, would be a plant that was here in this particular area of North America before European settlement. So before the white man came. That's the old definition that focused on location and time. So every plant's a native plant to somewhere. So when people are saying native plant, the assumption is they are referring to the particular location they grow in, or they're speaking in, or whatever. Because Norway spruce are native to Norway, but they're certainly not native here, for instance. Then the question becomes, okay, so that native plant, is it really native to your geographic area? There are a lot of plants that get a lot of hype about being North American natives, and they actually aren't native to all areas. And this is the poster child for native plants, right? This is the Perennial Plant Association's Plant of the Year many years ago now, in the mid-2000s, and this became the Echinacea purpurea, the purple cone flower, became the poster child for North American native plants. It's not native to southwestern Pennsylvania. As best we can tell, the native range probably ends maybe 100 miles or so west. Some people will argue that's just because we don't have good records for, necessarily the right records for this area, but we don't have anything of substantiating that this plant was actually growing around here prior to European settlement. Now, is this a bad non-native plant? If you have this in your garden, should you rip it out? This is one of the more benign non-natives in this area. It actually has a lot of ecosystem services. So you'll find a lot of pollinating insects on it, bees, wasps, and so on. Butterflies will use it for pollen and nectar. And a lot of birds, particularly little finches, like the seeds. So this is an example of a plant that isn't probably native to this area, that nevertheless does provide some ecosystem services. Well, what the heck does that mean then, right? I'm moving into the contemporary and more scientific instead of historical and geographical definition of a native plant. And it's really based on function, not history. So was it here before European settlement? But why is that important? What are we looking at this timeline? Because we're concerned about giving that plant time enough to co-evolve with the other creatures around it, whether they're bacteria, whether they're birds, whether they're turtles, whatever, and actually develop mutually interdependent relationships. So it's having a place in the ecology and supporting other wildlife. So is it native to an area is measured by time and location, and also that facilitates the coevolution of mutually beneficial relationships with other wildlife, whether they're plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, whatever. So if it's doing things that are helpful to other creatures that are native to that area, then we say that it has ecosystem functions. That's what we're looking at. So it's really a scientific, ecological, functionally based definition. Turns out that there are more than 2,000 native plant species in Pennsylvania. So you have a lot of things to choose from. There's not a lot blooming at this moment, except the Mertensias in my front yard, at least, are blooming. It's Mertensia virginiata, that's Virginia bluebells. Yes, it is native to Pennsylvania, even though it's named after Virginia. And it's really important for early spring pollinators. For instance, queen bumblebees are out. Some of my orchard mason bees, I've seen them flying, and they are looking for pollen and nectar. And this is one of the native sources that's going to be available very early in spring. Why early spring important? We'll talk about that later. But first, a bigger picture. Why garden with native plants? Why, when you're choosing an ornamental? So I'm ignoring vegetable and fruit. Well, I'm not really ignoring fruit, but vegetable gardening, I am not going to say don't grow tomatoes because they are not native to Pennsylvania. I'm going to grow tomatoes no matter what. I'm talking about things that you've chosen for ornamental reasons. And also fruit. We have a lot of native fruits. Really, that's ornamental or decorative things that a lot of people say, I love to garden. And there's that distinction between, you know, vegetable gardening and everything else. It's kind of everything else. So why choose natives over non-natives? Why would you do this instead of a hybrid tea rose or a rose of Sharon bush or whatever? Why focus on natives and get more of them in your garden, or only those in your garden? And that's because of that ecosystem function and those connections now. That the landscape, the natural landscape has been altered so much by humans. There's been so much damage done, destruction of habitat and all sorts of other things, that now by choosing what you garden with, what you garden for, you can actually, individual homeowners, even with a little urban backyard or suburban backyard, can actually provision and provide for wildlife and start shifting that balance and making a difference. So you can alter or contribute to the future of biodiversity in North America or in other countries, depending on where you're living and where you're zooming in from. If you haven't looked at this book or heard Doug Tallamy speak or read about his work, or you want to say, where do I start learning more about natives? This is the book that most people would say started kind of the current upsurge of interest in native plants and also the current upsurge of understanding scientifically their importance. This is his first book, Bringing Nature Home. Doug Tallamy's an entomologist. His specialty is study of insects at the University of Delaware. And kind of the best recognized spokesperson for the importance of native plants. So I do have on one of these handouts, let me find the appropriate handout. On one has a list of native woodies on the front. On the back, apologies, it's upside down. I don't think our administrative assistant caught that. But on the back, I have a various things, including photos of covers of 5 different books that are about different aspects of native plant gardening. So if you're building your native plant library, and you're going to the library to borrow books about native plants, these are the ones I recommend. These are your starting points. Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope as the science behind the importance of native plants, explaining why. A New Garden Ethic about the ethical imperative of native plants. And Prairie Up and Planting in a Post-Wild World, a lot of practical information about how to incorporate this into your garden and landscape. So much of this gardening with native plants comes back to gardening to support our native animals. And the recognition of the importance of native plants really comes out of the species decline, largely in animals, and out of that group, largely in insects. So look at this, something, a million plant and animal species threatened with extinction. Huge declines, 40% of amphibians, of salamanders and frogs and such, toads, are at risk of extinction worldwide. Look at this and you don't think plants, you look at this, corals and mammals and sharks and rays and crustaceans, animals, but conifers, pine trees, right? 1/3 of the species of pine trees are in danger of extinction worldwide. So there are lots of reasons that can have contributed to this, but at the top of the list are loss of habitat, and that means loss of biodiversity. The decline that's probably gotten the most media attention is the insect apocalypse, famously called in this New York Times article from 2018. And there were some very large international studies that were done, that were just being published in that time, showing this incredible decline in the numbers of butterflies and moths, lepidopterans, that's order Lepidoptera, and also other invertebrates. So these are your other insects. These are the troop bugs, these are the flies, these are the beetles, and so on and so forth. And the trend is absolutely steeply downward and isn't changing. So that almost 50% decline in insect populations worldwide in the last 50 years. Why does that matter? Why the concern about insects? Because insects are the little things that run the world. All of our food webs, what we used to call food webs or food pyramids, and so many other ecosystem services like decomposition of organic matter comes back ultimately if you trace it through the connections to the insects, the environment would collapse into chaos. The estimate is that if every insect on Earth vanished right now, all of the birds and all of the amphibians would be gone in 2 months. Every bird, every amphibian dead if all the insects disappeared. What about humans? Well, we're as connected as they are, whether or not we recognize it. And there are already studies showing tremendous changes in things like our crop yields in a world with growing population and shrinking food supply, and most importantly, shrinking vegetables and fruits, the foods that are nutritious, that have the high vitamin content, for instance, not the rice and the wheat that's a lot of empty carbs, but the high vitamin and nutrient content. So this article came out just a year ago, newspaper article about a study that showed that 3/4 of crops, this is for human consumption, either are totally dependent on insect pollination or their yields are enhanced by insect pollination. And that's literally A to Z, apples to zucchini, and just about everything in between, except the wind pollinated grasses, the grains, the corns, the rice, the oats, the wheat. But of the flowering crops, 3/4 of them really depend on pollination by insects for a good yield. But insects are in decline. So how is this affecting us humans on Earth? Studies have shown that crop yields around the planet are going down by as much as 5% already in vegetables and fruits. The other problem with that is that loss, again, vegetables and fruits, these are our nutritious foods. These are the high vitamin, high phytochemicals, high nutrient foods. And without those people, especially people who already have other issues, particularly heart disease and cancer, nutrition plays a real role in your susceptibility to that. So the estimate is that there are 500,000 people on Earth dying early every year because of inadequate nutrition due to lower crop yields that it's traced directly back to insects. So the impacts are being felt, they're real, even if individuals don't necessarily see them. If you go out and quantitate them, you see that. So what does that leave us doing? What can we what can I in Washington, Pennsylvania with 1/3 of an acre do about this? What can you do? Well, we have to turn to the people who do the studies, who do the research, not read something on the web and say, I did my research, but actually go out and do the experiments, collect the data, statistically analyze it, figure out what's going on. And there was an article that came out a couple of years ago in one of the most prominent scientific research journals in the world, that outlined, based on the scientific study, what things any person can do to change this, particularly with respect to insects. And their number 1 and 2 recommendations are more gardens with more native plants. Get rid of the lawn. Lawn grass is essentially useless, except it produces a little oxygen. There's almost nothing that eats that lives off that. Convert it to gardens, diverse natural habitats, and in them, the more native plants, the better. The others are things like reduce pesticide use, reduce nighttime lighting, lots of other things. We could go through all 8 later if you're interested. But the 2 big ones are reduce the lawn and get it into natural habitats and grow native plants. Why? Because these native plants support a lot more wildlife and contribute to more biodiversity than the non-native plants. How do we know that? Because of hundreds upon hundreds of scientific studies by scientists all over the world. I don't have time to talk about them all, but I did want to pull out some interesting data and show you. For instance, one example of plants that are all around us. Norway maples, a fairly widespread backyard tree, non-native to North America, compared to sugar maples, a great native North American tree, also native in this area. So how many butterflies and moth species, lepidopterans, are supported by these 2 different species of maples? And unless you look closely and are familiar with those trees, to the casual observer, they're basically indistinguishable. But not to the butterflies and moths, because we have only documented 7 different species of butterflies and moths that can use Norway maples. When we say use, we mean they can lay their eggs on them and the caterpillars can eat the leaves or the twigs or the buds or whatever. A food source for raising the babies. Without caterpillars, you don't have butterflies and moths adults. So, okay, 7. Sugar, anyone guess the sugar maple numbers? Oh, 238 documented. It's a huge difference. Now, you're not necessarily going to find 238 different species of butterflies and moths on your sugar maple, but those are the total numbers that have been documented. Those insects spent thousands upon thousands of years evolving with these sugar maples and developing these complex interdependent relationships. It just hasn't happened with the Norway maples. And we see these numbers over and over, these massive differences when we look at all different species of plants. So let's look at some averages. So this was a study done, again, Doug Talamay's lab, looking at almost 1,400 different plant genera. So these are the the genus and species names. So for instance, maples are acre. So they would be looking at all the maples and comparing the natives and the non-natives in terms of how many butterflies and moths use those, have been seen on those, laying their eggs, feeding the caterpillars. So looking at almost 1,400 essentially different types of plants across the mid-Atlantic states. On average, native plants supported 5. So that's the average, 5 different species of butterflies and moths. On average, non-native plants support 74. That's a huge difference. But wait a minute, this is all butterflies and moths, lepidopterans. Why the focus on butterflies and moths? When we think about pollinating insects, we usually think bees. Butterflies and moths are pollinators, and they do play roles in pollinating many of our plants, but they don't have the same impact as pollinators as bees. But why butterflies and moths? Why are they focused on this? And in this case, it's not about the crop plants, it's about babies. Because that male robin, we think, we tend to associate American robins with earthworms. That's not what they're feeding mostly to the children. The nestlings are getting caterpillars, larval butterflies and moths. Something like 96% of terrestrial birds that live on land in North America depend on butterflies and moth caterpillars for feeding their young. No butterflies and moths, no babies. And all of the other services, think about that. Robin isn't saying, oh, that's a pretty caterpillar, it's going to turn into a monarch butterfly, or that's an ugly caterpillar, it's going to turn into a cabbage worm and it's going to eat her cabbage moth, and it's going to eat her cabbages and her broccoli, so we're going to consume that. So they are consuming things that we like, but they're also consuming a lot of pest insects. And there we go back to agriculture and human crops. Okay. So if you want to support butterflies and moths, and therefore birds and lots of other critters, what native plants do you choose? Because they're not all equivalent. Some are used more than others. I gave you a cheat sheet. Same handout with the photos of the books. You'll find this list. This is a list that I just took from data published. On the opposite side, you'll see a much more comprehensive list, but the opposite side only refers to woody plants. So this is trees and shrubs. This shorter list, I have woodies, and I also have the perennials. So the things you think of as flowers and grasses. But the winner for supporting butterflies and moths is oaks, Quercus species, all the different oaks. More than 550 different species of butterflies and moths have been shown to use oaks as a place to lay their eggs and let their caterpillars feed. And you see others, cherries, willows, so that includes the pussy willows that so many people love, birch, crab apples. Most of the crab apples that you see are actually a hybrid between native and a native crab apple and a non-native crab apple. So it's there's our maples, blueberries, there you go, alders, hickories. Look, all these trees that we have around us or could plant around us, hosting hundreds of different species of butterflies and moths, or potentially hosting hundreds of different species of butterflies and moths. But oaks wins the award as far as all the studies have shown. If you want to learn more about oaks, I'll turn you to another book by Doug Tallamy, The Nature of Oaks, which is all oaks all the time, and the ecology of oaks, and not just their connection with lepidopteran species, butterflies and moths, but their larger place in the whole ecosystem. So another great read. So wait a minute. Dr. DeBerry just told me to plant oaks. Look at this. They get 70 feet tall. They get 80 feet tall. I have a 1/4 acre backyard. What? How? She wants me to plant a 70-foot what? So that's one issue that people face is, okay, there are some smaller oaks, but I don't have room for the tree that's gonna be 40 feet tall in its maturity. Well, I have some good news for you. We have 2 species of dwarf oaks in Pennsylvania that actually grow only to be like a large shrub. The one that I've seen available in commerce at native plant nurseries is the dwarf chinkapin oak or the dwarf chestnut oak. And it just becomes a big shrub. And it doesn't take too many years until it starts, mine was in the ground maybe 3 years before it started producing acorns. So squirrels love it. This does not show the insect damage feeding to the leaves. I know that mine's providing ecosystem services to the insects because when I go to my hedgerow and look at the oaks, those leaves have holes all over them. And I am so excited because that means somebody's eating it. And that's the whole point. Then people say, well, I don't want bugs eating my plants, right? lots of studies have shown that most people don't even notice insect damage to plant foliage until 30% of the foliage is damaged. So you could have a feast for the wildlife, for the caterpillars, and most people, your neighbor's not going to notice and say, oh, look at the holes in that Swiss cheese oak or whatever. Or you can turn around and say, that's exactly what I got it for. Because gardening can't be about me alone anymore. It has to be about me and the other creatures that we share the earth with, or we're not going to be here. The woody plants and also herbaceous perennials, the flowers, the grasses and sedges and so on. Not quite as many species of butterflies and moths supported, but still in the hundreds or at least in the dozens. When you're looking at these lists and shopping, remember, these are the native species. So for instance, there are lots of species of iris that are native, but there are also lots that aren't. Siberian irises obviously aren't. Those bearded irises that you see blooming around Memorial Day, the really huge flowers, they're not native. So if you want irises that support the local wildlife, then look for the native species of irises. And remember, more than 2,000 species of native plants in Pennsylvania. You will find things that you like, that fit your space, that are pretty, that will work well in your garden. So that goes back to fitting the space. It's all about right plant, right place. So if you want success, whether you're growing native plants, whether you're growing your tomatoes or spinach or whatever, you have to know a little bit about the location that you want to put that plant and what the plant needs. Because you could have the most beautiful native plant, and if it needs moist soil and partial shade, and you put it out in the middle of your yard where it gets shade, where it gets sunshine all day, and the soil is dry and rocky, it's going to die. So it's about knowing your soil conditions. It's about knowing your sun exposure. It's about knowing the moisture, even the pH, whether your soil is acidic or basic or neutral. And thinking, and then learning, what do these plants need? If I have a shady, moist spot, I need to start looking at plants that like shady, moist spots. If I have a sunny, dry spot, I need to look for plants that like sunny, dry spots. So going and just buying a plant because it's pretty and plopping it somewhere because you have a space often leads to dead plant, gardener frustration, and you just say, forget it. And, you know, then that $15 or whatever is gone. Another thing to think about when you're gardening for wildlife, for ecological diversity, is what do those other creatures need? I had this thing this idea I developed a while back that I called DeBerry's rule of 3. And the rule was, when you plant something that's not a food crop, so I'm not talking about the vegetables, right, or most of the fruits, but when you're planting something ornamental, think, who is this serving? And find things that serve 3 others or 3. You are 1. So you can plant it if you think it's pretty or whatever. So you get 1. But what about the other 2? Is this plant going to benefit birds? Is this going, maybe it has berries for birds. Is it going to benefit bees? Is it going to benefit, do the rabbits eat the foliage in the winter? What are 2 other creatures, not human species, but 2 other species that are benefiting from this? And if you can find 3, if you can find more, that's great. You can find 3, then get that plant in the ground, in the right place. So, and design it with pollinator insects in mind. So there are a couple of simple rules of design that not only make your garden look better, according to the garden designers, but help the wildlife find the resources you've given to. And one that you'll hear over and over again from the garden designers, plant in drifts. Don't put one, goldenrod over there and one goldenrod over there and one goldenrod over there. And imagine going to the grocery store and the peppers are at the front of aisle 2 and the corn is at the back of aisle 7. And then if you want mushrooms, you're going to have to go to the middle of aisle 17 and you're all over the place. It's going to take more time and you're going to use a lot more energy and you may even miss it. So cluster together, just like all the produce is in the produce section. You want the vegetables and fruits, you're in the produce section. You want the frozen dinners, you're in the frozen dinner section. Cluster them together. Plant in these single species clusters, what are called drifts. The designers say drifts of 3, 5, or 7, or 11 or whatever, but odd numbers and at least 3. You want a clump that's about that big around. They think, I gotta hug it. 3 feet or so in diameter. It's easier for your creatures to find, and they don't have to spend their time running all over the grocery store, picking up one thing there and one thing there. They can go and feed and get a load of pollen or nectar right in this little space. So less energy for the same amount of reward of supplies. At least 3 plants of the same species, at least 3 feet in diameter. So yes, I'm giving you permission to buy a lot of plants. Or swap a lot of plants, or start a lot of seeds. Okay. A diversity of species. You go in the grocery store, you expect more than just romaine, lettuce, and turnips. You need lots of different things with lots of different nutrients. Same thing for the non-human creatures that you're trying to take care of. The magic number seems to be 8 or more. Any native plants you can add is going to help. But the turning point in actually being able to really supply a diversity of materials and resources seems to be 8 different species. Look for different flower colors, different flower shapes, and spread out throughout the season. Because they're hungry all year round. Have something in bloom all season. So really we're talking mid-March through at least early November. And for native plants, the interesting thing, it seems to be toughest in the middle of the summer when so many non-natives, you think June, and you think roses, tea roses, and peonies, and bearded irises, and all those things, and daylilies, and it's like, okay, and the natives, that's kind of when the natives are bursting out in spring and early summer and late summer and early fall, through late fall. Why? Why is early spring and why is late fall so important? I'll give you one reason, and that's through the story of the bumblebees. If you picked up one of the handouts, you may have gotten the one that said Humblebee, Bumblebee. It's some information about bumblebee lifestyle. Some things you might not know. Bumblebee colonies are really small compared to honeybees. Honeybees may have 50,000 insects in a hive. Bumblebee colonies are a few hundred. The only individual that survives over the winter is the queen, the fertile queen. Everybody else dies off in autumn. So in March, when things are starting to bloom and when the weather's warming, she comes out of her underground tunnel and she's hungry. She needs pollen and nectar. There's nobody else around. She's not waiting for drones to bring her food or workers to bring her food or whatever. She has to take care of herself. What's one of the first things she does after eat? She lays eggs that were fertilized by her mating with the drone here in late autumn. It's only about 8. These are the kids. So to get that colony going again and to start raising the next generation, she has to have access to blooming flowers that provide the nutrients that she needs and that she recognizes as a food source. Early spring. Same situation in fall. Yes, her children are dying off, but she needs the energy to mate, and the drones need the energy to mate with her. And she's got to provision herself to stay alive all winter in that underground tunnel. So a lot of native planting for wildlife is, especially for pollinators, is focused on things that bloom early in the spring and things that bloom late in the fall. So I want to show you just a couple of examples of each. These are getting ready to go. I've seen a couple of these opening in warmer spots. Serviceberries, or shadbush, or shadblow, or juneberries. They're all different types of names for these beautiful little native trees or small or large shrubs. Depending on the species, some are more tree-like, some are more shrub-like with more branches or more trunks. Right. They not only have beautiful little white flowers, starting to bloom, they'll be blooming soon. Look at that, host plant for more than 100 species of butterflies and moths. And it's not just butterflies and moths and bees, but birds. Okay, we'll get there. So, and delightful to the eye, beautiful color in the fall. So this is a good small tree, ornamental tree for a small property, or a great hedgerow or whatever. And when those flowers are pollinated and they ripen the fruits in June, the fruits are delicious if you have a chance to ever get them. I never do. I have 2 of these bushes in 2 very different locations at my property, and the robins just strip them bare before the fruits ever ripen. If you do get a chance to eat the fruits are delicious. They're absolutely fantastic. They taste to me like a kind of a cross between blueberries and walnuts. You'll hear other descriptions, but that's a fantastic. I have had cedar waxwings at my tree. So look at this, pollinators, pollinating insects, birds, me. Hey, I hit my rule of 3. Eastern redbuds. I learned them as Judas trees where I grew up. Another important early spring plant for pollinators, not as many butterflies and moths, but some. Okay, so pollinating insects like bees, butterflies and moths, there's 2. What about me? Okay, it's pretty, actually, I hate that color, don't tell. But lots of people love it, so you could say that makes them happy, but did you know that the flowers are edible? They're delicious. Just pick them and throw them in raw in salads. They're fantastic. So there's my 3. 2 examples of many, many great native plants for early spring, mid-spring. But I want to look at fall too, and hit maybe the 2 most important genera of plants for autumn around here: asters and goldenrods. There are 35 different aster species that are native to Pennsylvania. You're going to find an aster for any condition you have. You're going to find asters that are 6 feet tall and like wet areas. You're going to find asters that are 10 inches tall and like dry shade. Oops. Did I say a cuss word? Dry shade. Like the gardener's biggest enemy, dry shade. Dry shade. Whitewood asters, love it. Important late autumn plant. Butterflies, great. Bees, me. 3, it's great. So any condition that you have in your property, you'll find an aster that'll do well there, a native aster. Goldenrods are in the same situation. We have about 11 species of goldenrod that are native to Pennsylvania. Again, you know, chest height to knee high or shorter. Dry shade like Solidago sacea here, to full sun and drier conditions and moisture conditions as well, or some. More than 100 species of butterflies. Wait a minute. I'm allergic to goldenrods. No, you're not. Poor goldenrod, especially Canada goldenrod, which is aggressive. You might not want that one in your backyard because those rhizomes spread like crazy. That's all right. There are 10 other species that are native that don't spread like that. But no matter which goldenrod, they are not causing your allergies. Think about that pollen. It's big. Those flowers are showy. They're covered with insects. That pollen is too big and too heavy to spread very far by the wind. That's why they're attracting the insects, so the insects can carry the pollen. That pollen is not going to blow up your nose and make you sneeze. But it's blooming. Okay? Conspicuous flowers, showy, large, heavy pollen, probably not allergenic, but it's blooming at the same time as that. That's ragweed. Yeah, who notices it? Inconspicuous flowers, usually green or just a dull color. You might not even realize those are the flowers. Tiny little pollen. How's that pollen traveling around? It's blown by the wind. Where? Onto your clothes, up your nose. That's you. So poor goldenrod's a fantastic native plant, and people don't plant them because they mistakenly think they're causing allergies when it's really this very inconspicuous thing that's like, goldenrod's getting the blame. So goldenrods are fantastic for fall, supporting so many of our native insects. But why do we fail? I hope no one minds. I'm going to sit. I'm recovering from a knee injury, and I'm usually a pacer, but I'm going to pull up a chair so that I can go for the last little bit here. Because I'm sure you all know someone who set out to make a garden, and it was too much. It became a weedy mess, right? It was overwhelming. And 2 years later, they're just like, forget it. All this hype. I don't know what these people are crazy. Why do so many gardens fail? Because they look like that. Okay, not just the hostas. But they look like, where are the plants? There are like no plants there. Or they look like this. I don't see a single plant in that image that is native, certainly not to Pennsylvania. Liriope, no. Barberries, really evil. I think those are probably English boxwoods. I don't know what those things are. And look what else, the other big problem, mulch. Ground up hardwood mulch. Because you left the ground uncovered. So you put mulch on instead of living things like nature does. If the ground is not covered with plants, weeds will come in. Weeds will come in. So what do? You cover the ground with plants. Yes, I'm encouraging you to go out and spend more money. Or go to swaps. Whatever. Or buy some seeds, although that's kind of challenging with a lot of native plants to seed start. So what's the solution? Did Dr. DeBerry just sell me, gave me permission to spend $2,000 as a plant nursery? Yeah, do it, great. But if you don't want to, or have that kind of money to do it, or don't have the energy, then start in a small space. and fill it instead of a big space that looks like that. And then you gotta buy the mulch and you have to renew the mulch and the weeds are still gonna come up through there anyway. Crowd them out with other plants. Because when we're gardening, we want the pretty showy things, right? Or we're concerned about the woodies, the trees, the shrubs, maybe the big showy things like the Joe Pye weeds, the purpuritas. And others, the echinacеas, the liatris, so there's kind of shorter herbaceous perennials, knee-high, thigh-high things. And then we put those in, and there's all that empty space, and that's what we mulch. And when you first start growing your garden, you may need to put mulch in there. You may need to put the ground up leaves or the stuff from your compost pile maybe, or the, the woody mulch. But the goal is to have that space filled in with plants as quickly as possible. And that's why the focus more and more in gardening is getting that ground cover layer. You may have heard the term matrix planting or plant the matrix. Those are the short ground covers that fill those spaces that act as living mulch. You buy them once, if they're in a good spot, they grow, they spread, they take over. You don't have to buy mulch. Ground up bark mulch, 7 cubic yards delivered, and now you have this huge pile and you're embarrassed because the neighbors are staring at it and you're out there moving 50 wheelbarrows loads of mulch on Saturday morning, and then you spend Sunday flat on your back with a hot pad, right? No, let the plants do the work. Don't ask me how I know. Let the plants do the work for you. And there are many, many wonderful species of native ground covers. Things like wild strawberries, okay, the white, if you have the little things that look like strawberries, but they have the yellow flowers, they're not native, and we can talk about those afterwards if you'd like. Violets are starting to bloom now, and they are fantastic. The different shades of blue and purple, or the white and blue ones, they're native, and they are actually, you may not realize, important host plants for certain types of fritillary butterflies. Plus, in my yard, the foliage is just eaten down all winter by the bunnies, the rabbits, but it's coming back up. And of course, you can eat them too. Not just the flowers, the leaves as well. I think I mentioned white wood aster. This is a fantastic, it only gets about 8 to 10 inches tall. It loves dry shade. And sedges, the grasses relative. So you can think of these as tiny little grasses that may only get 6 inches or 8 inches or maybe 12 for some species inches tall. Another thing I love about these sedges, and I saw that this morning as I was leaving for work, a male robin hopping around some of the sedges in front of our yard. And my spouse said, "What is that bird doing? Is it having a seizure?" So I looked, and it was pulling the dead leaves off the sedges, and we watched it fly to the neighbor's light fixture under her garage. It was using it to build a nest. So where can you get native plants? I have some info for you. I have a flyer listing the native nurseries in the area. That is kind of Pittsburgh down to Washington. I also have some information about upcoming native plant sales and plant swaps. I have a flyer from Arcadia Natives. I am not financially connected to them in any way, shape, or form. She's just a friend. She's doing amazing things for native plants. It's an incredible nursery down in Washington. So that's where you can obtain. What I want to focus on talking about is what not to do. And that's not to go out and buy one of these wildflower mixes and put it on some bare soil and say, I'm going to grow a wildflower meadow or whatever. And you'll see them sold everywhere. And it says, look, Pennsylvania wildflower mix. And you think, this is great. It's for Pennsylvania. If you look at the list, I think I went through this and there are only 2 that are native to Pennsylvania. Right? Plains for, you look, Siberian wallflower, okay, in January kind of did feel like Siberia, but seriously, cosmos, they're actually can be really invasive. Cornflowers, another bad one. Somewhere there was California poppy. I mean, almost all of those are annuals so that you get pretty flowers the first year and you make the homeowner happy. A lot of them will not self-seed and come back, and almost none of them are native. Just don't. It's leading to frustration. Look for the nurseries that sell native plants. Look for the gardening organizations that have native plant sales, and look for groups that have plant swaps. And that handout shows you some of each. Seeds can be difficult. A lot of native plants evolved to drop their seeds outside in the summer or fall, and then they go through the winter, and then the seeds germinate again. So most native plants, for their seeds to germinate and make little seedlings, must go through an extended period of cold, usually cold and moist. It's called cold stratification. Some need 30 days, some need 60 days, some need more, some need 2 seasons. They have to go through 2 winters. If you want to get into it, this is fantastic. But if you're maybe just starting out in the native plant world or just don't want to get that involved, start with the plants rather than the seeds. So, Dr. Berry just told me that I need to rewild my yard. I need to make habitat for wildlife. What are the neighbors gonna think? Well, Peters Township has an ordinance. It's the last time I checked, because I used it as a model for my township's ordinance that protects native habitat yards. Now, that doesn't mean that your neighbor might not be giving you the hairy eyeball and wondering what is happening next door, but you have legal protection. But what about the neighbors who think this doesn't look? One of the problems is that our culture has come to accept a neat, orderly, ecologically barren monoculture of lawn grass as the model, and that's a sign of a good homeowner who's kept it neat and tidy. It's a desert, it's ecologically useless, but that's the standard, and that's what people view as a sign of a good homeowner, a good neighbor. So what if you're not a good neighbor to those people, but you're a good neighbor to all the other living things on the planet? How do you do this and keep peace, or attempt to keep peace with the neighbors who haven't figured out what to do yet? Provide what are called cues to care. So you need to make the novel familiar. You need to provide unmistakable indications that this is part of a plan. How do you do that? This is a great, I mean, yeah, move me in. Look, a mown path. Now, if you wanted to make it even more intentional looking, maybe edges. So you might edge that with stone, or edge that with logs or something. But this is intentional. It just didn't go crazy. Someone's out there taking care of part of it. This was done deliberately. Wildlife feeders. I'm trying to attract those squirrels. I'm trying to attract those birds. Other aspects of human design, fences or lawn furniture or garden ornaments. There you go, providing for someone else. When I put water out in the spring, almost always the first creatures that come are not birds, but are bees. Signage. There are so many signs that you can get. I'm gardening for pollinators, leave the leaves or whatever. And there are gardening organizations and wildlife conservation organizations that you can get your yard certified and purchase signs and become a backyard wildlife habitat or an Audubon bird habitat or part of the Monarch Way Station or Penn State certified pollinator gardens or so on. So this is another way to tell the neighbors, I'm doing this on purpose, and this is the purpose. Oh, and I swim down in the summer. But doesn't that look fantastic? Just get out there, be seen, and you don't, working is great, but also be seen enjoying it. Don't just send that message, I'm out here taking care of it, but I'm out here and I'm loving it. And if all else fails, I'll tell you my secret weapon. What I have learned is that it is very difficult for your neighbor to complain about your yard if they have eaten from it. Give them, even the zucchinis, I mean, you gotta get rid of zucchinis, right? Give them something. Give them food, chicken, egg, whatever. And they might not like my chickens, but it's gonna be very difficult to complain about my chickens after they've taken a dozen eggs or a handful of tomatoes or whatever. So that is my secret weapon for keeping the peace among the neighbors. But finally, just do it. Think about